Okay, so I've downloaded and extracted that version of the medical office, the final one from the end of last term, into my C drive, my work folder, and away we go. I'll just open that up. Okay, and I'll just do a quick rebuild here, and that's finished. All right, that's one of the things I usually do. Okay, so here's my text file, my copy paste file, right? So for this master detail page example, we're going to manage appointments on basically what will effectively become our patient details view. But instead of doing like we did in that last example, the model for the view will be the actual collection of appointments, right? Not the patient. We'll pass the patient as an object so we can take advantage of all the metadata and get it there at the top of the page. But because we want to add sorting, filtering, and paging to the appointments themselves, this approach will give us the power to do that. Now, fortunately for this demo, I chose appointments because we already have the model classes for appointments and reasons for appointments, right? That's already all there. We have sample data being generated, right? So we even created controllers and views, right, for the actual appointments. You might remember that. Now, I told you at the time, don't worry about completing them, right? Going in and fixing all the controllers to add our try-catch approach and so on and so forth. I said, don't even bother because we're going to be using a different approach to implementing this anyway. And we just didn't get time last term, so that's the first one of our learning moments now to get it done and out of the way. All right. So as I say here, what we're going to do is we're going to make, just for so I can compare, I could take the existing appointment controller and modify it, but I'm going to make a new controller based on the appointment class, but I'm going to call it something else. It's really going to be my patient appointment controller, so I'm going to call it that. Now at this point, I'm moving my copy paste file off to the other screen, and that way I can more easily use it as we go through and work here. So if I right click, add a controller. Okay, it'll be MVC controller with all the goods. And it will be using our medical office context. And I'm going to base it right on the appointment. Okay, so it wants to call it appointments 1 because I already have an appointments controller. But I'm going to change that to patient, APPTS, or just APPT, sorry. Yeah. All right, and we'll let it generate everything for us. So just give that a moment. Okay, so I'm going to go through it a bit a step at a time here. I'm going to skip the index for now because in the end that's going to be pretty full of code because we're going to add there all of the sorting, filtering, and paging that we require, right? Okay, so you can see though, just even glancing here in the index, this is the standard approach, right? Automatically the scaffolding generated this. It's appointments, including the appointment reason, and including the patient, right? Okay, we'll come back to the index in a minute. A quick word about details. We're actually using the index, okay, of this particular controller and this index view as our patient details. So I will never need details of a detail. So, I can just get rid of that. I don't even need it, right? So now we come down to the get and the post for create, right? And we have this, all of these select lists being generated and so on. Okay. Um, what I'm going to do, what I often do in a situation, and you see me you saw me do this once before, is when I'm changing the overall use of a controller away from the normal way we implement a controller, I like to remind myself that this does not behave in the standard way by just changing the names of these verbs, these action verbs, right? So instead of create, I'll usually use add, right? Instead of edit, I'll use update. Instead of delete, I'll use remove. So I'm going to actually change that here. So my add, right? Plus I'm going to need my populate drop-down list. Maybe I'll get that in place first. Hang on a second. I'm going to go right down to the bottom here, next to the bottom, where I usually put things like populate drop-down lists, right? So populate drop-down list calls my appointment reasons select list, okay? And that's right here. Now, notice that I don't need a drop-down list for patient, right? This was scaffolded expecting I have to choose the patient. Well, this will always already focus on a predefined patient, which is why I don't need a patient ID select list, right? Because I don't need to worry about selecting a patient. I'll only come here with already an individual patient selected and in mind. Okay, let me get back up to the ad then, right? Okay, so here's my first create the post. So let me replace it with the actual code I'm going to use. Now, as I do so, you'll see that I've added some new parameters as well, right? Because we're going to come here assuming we know who the patient is. Okay, I'll have a nullable in here for the patient ID, and I will have the patient name, right? Okay, so those are going to be parameters I pass in, and I'm just going to triple check that the patient ID has value. And if it doesn't, well, I'm going to go back to the patient index, right? And that should just get me out of here because, hey, if I don't have a patient to work with, I've got no business being here. Okay, now, oh, I got some red underlining because I need to add my using for the utilities. I didn't mean to complicate it, but I do want to as well. Whenever we have paging, sorting, filtering, it's nice to use this technique we learned of using a cookie to maintain the return URL, right? So that we can go back again. So if I'm adding a patient and I click to go back, I want to come back again looking at this new patient details, master detail view, which technically is an index view, but that's okay, right? So it'll bring us back there where we wanted to be. Okay. Yep. Okay. Oops. You see, I'm getting all kinds of blood all over the screen here. Red underlines on everything. Usually when that happens after a copy paste. And sure enough, I accidentally took one extra bracket that I didn't want. So let me just take that out and that should fix up the problem. And there, now all the red underlining has gone away. Okay. So the idea here though is we're going to be bringing up the appointment, right? But we're going to actually generate a new appointment so that we can firmly fix already, right, the patient to this appointment. There's no question. This we're adding an appointment. It's going to be the predefined patient as identified by our patient ID. So that's the extra step we're doing here. Then we just return our view, and it's not going to be that different from the normal create view, right? But we have already created the appointment object and set the patient appropriately. All right, so that's it. By the way, I'm also throwing the patient name into view data because the create process is the only one we have to do that with because, of course, we haven't created it yet, right? So we don't already have a patient assigned to this appointment because the appointment hasn't been saved to the database. So at that point, we have to still save the patient name in order to nicely show it in big letters at the top of the screen. So there's no confusion as to whose appointment we're adding here. Okay, now for the post part, of course, besides adding their good try catch and so on, there's a little bit more work involved now. So let me just get this in place. So this is the second half of the add process, right? So notice we're using add still. Okay, but this is all the same standard stuff. And we also are getting the patient name in case we have to go back a second time and show a validation error. We do want that, right? This is just a standard way to make sure we get the proper return URL for our current controller we're working in. Okay, so basically we save changes and then we take advantage of our return URL and we go back there, right? So it'll bring us back to the basically the master details view for this one patient that we already have. All right. And then this is just, of course, in case we have to display due to a validation error message or some database error message, right? Okay, so that's the add process. Now, I won't make you watch me go through each. I'm going to copy paste the rest so I don't mess it up so easily, but we will walk through all the code and talk about it. Okay, did a quick build to make sure my copy paste didn't introduce any errors. All right, so let's just quickly look then for the update process. Again, we'll need the ID, but in this case, the ID is the actual ID of the appointment, right? Once again, our code to fix our return URL, just for that sorting, filtering, paging business. We can get our appointment, right, with all the necessary includes, and popular drop-down lists, and away we go. So it's very much standard here, right? I don't have to worry about the name anymore because after all, when I pull up the appointment from the database, it's already been saved with a patient. So I'll have that patient name because we're including the patient in our link query. And then on the post side, right? Again, it's following our try update model approach, right? So we get the appointment, the usual step, fix our return URL, and go through and actually try to update the model. If it's successful, there's no validation errors that way. Then we update it, save changes, and then we redirect to our return URL, right? Um, Back down here, if we do need to redisplay the standard populate drop-down lists and return view on the appointment update. Remove is basically delete, okay? So similarly, right, we'll get the appointment to remove, fix our return URL, display it, and the usual approach, just go ahead and get the appointment again, fix the return URL, delete it, hopefully we can successfully do so, and then redirect back to the return URL, right? And that's basically it. So it hasn't changed dramatically in terms of the add, update, and remove, right? The biggest one now, the biggest change is going to be at the very top, the index. Okay, so here's our index then for our patient appointment, right? So you see all the familiar looking parameters I have here. Now, one that wouldn't normally be here would be our patient ID, but we have to have that so we can identify, hey, this is appointments for who? For this patient, right? But I'm going to include paging with page size. We have our lookup for appointment reason for our filter, okay, and then our action buttons for sorting and filtering and so on. Okay, so didn't mean to complicate it, but you notice there's two different things happening here in terms of that return URL business, right? First of all, we're going to come to this controller, our patient appointment controller for appointments, from the patient, right? We'll click details for a given patient and come here. So if I want to go back, right, if I want to have a link to go back, I need to actually grab that return URL for the patients. That is kind of the beauty of that second method I taught last term of using cookies here to hold all of our filter, sort, and paging parameters, right? Because we can separately use a different cookie for each controller. So even though I'm working now in the patient app APPT controller, I can still grab and know what the actual last URL used was in the patient controller. And then we clear the one for our current controller, right? There we go. Okay, then we just do the usual thing. Remember, working with appointments, so I get my appointments, including the reason and the patient, right? And then we decide, are we adding our filters for the appointment reason, for text in the search string, right? Set up all the sorting. Are we sorting by reason, okay, or by date, okay? And there we go. Set our sort fields, and that's good. That's standard stuff. Ah, what's happening here? Well, remember, we want to show the list of appointments pre-filtered for the one patient we've identified, whose details we're viewing here. But how do we get that patient information at the top of the page? We'll do a separate link query, pulling up the patient with all the necessary includes we want, including maybe a thumbnail of the photo, right? History of conditions and all that stuff, where, right, we're matching the patient ID. And then we store that in view bag, right? Remember, view bag is basically view data. It's a wrapper around view data that supports what they call dynamic properties. So view data is normally a dictionary of strings. But if you have an object you want to store, that's where the view bag with its dynamic properties is more effective. Basically, it doesn't know as a dynamic property, it doesn't know really what class it is. It just knows it's an object, right? So we're storing this as an object in the view bag, the actual patient, the parent for the master detail page. Okay, this is just the usual page sizing stuff. So we can have our little modal come up to change page size, and away we go, and we return the page data. All right, so let's come back now. We're going to have to start working in the views. So if I come over to views, come to patient appointments, here are the ones that were created. So, right away, if I want, I can get rid of details. I'll never use it. I don't need details of details. The index essentially functions as the details for this one identified patient, right? And the model will be the appointments. Okay. I'm just going to get my copy paste code and put it all in place so I don't mess up here. Actually, before I put it all in place, I'm going to add this little snippet at the top. I changed my mind. Okay. See where we have our little region of C# here, right? Where we're setting the title in the view data. Well, I'm going to add one more line of code right here that does a lot of magic for us. What I'm doing here is I'm going to the view bag and that patient dynamic object that we created there. Now it's an object, but we're casting it with the full, now notice I have to fully qualify medical office.models, right? The full namespace of the patient class. So that takes all the data in our patient object here, casts it as an actual patient, right? And we store that here as a variable of type patient, okay, that's accessible then throughout all of our code. The advantage of that is that by casting it as a patient class object, we now have instantiated this copy of the patient and all the metadata, all the information from all the annotations in the class comes with it. So what you'll see is down below, we'll be able to use this, right, to get all the key information that we need about the patient with all the metadata included. Okay, well, that's that trick I was talking about that allows us to do that. Now you see that in the code, but for the rest of it, it's a bit here I'm going to mess up for sure if I don't copy and paste it at once. But what you see down below is a table listing all the appointments. That's still going to be here, but above it, above that information, we're going to show essentially what would be the same thing on a normal or typical patient details page, right? So let me get the rest of this in place. Actually, everything from here down. I'm going to, first of all, remove and then paste in our code. Hopefully I did it right. Okay. So don't panic. Okay. It looks like a lot, but really, once we've got the patient and we have our collection of appointments, this top section is really all about showing the details of this patient object, right? So you can see we're going into that patient object, getting the patient photo. We're going to show that on the screen if there is one. If there isn't one, that's where I'm going to go into my images folder, to my blank profile JPEG file and just show that instead, right? Okay, and we're just using a little class here, media body, goes along with our media class in Bootstrap, just allows us to have it nicely arranged beside the image. And essentially I just have a couple rows here, or sorry, a row with a couple columns showing the usual information that we would have on a patient detail page, right? But notice that we're getting it all from patient full name, patient OHIP. So all the metadata is coming through and allowing us to easily show everything without having to worry about extra formatting or display names, because it all comes from the metadata for our patient object. So all that information goes to the top of the screen. Right down here, of course, this loop is just going through all the patient conditions, building up that little popover in Bootstrap, so you can click it and see, that they have a history of heart attack and stroke and whatever, right? So that's pretty standard stuff that we've done before, right down to there. So basically everything down to 120, that I could almost have copied that out of the patient details page, put it in place, and just fixed it up a little bit. Now we come to the second half of the page. Here's our form, right? This is what typically we would have had on our index page, right? Storing our sort direction, sort field. Notice we do need to keep the patient ID here in a hidden input as well, right? And we just have a filter, okay, at the top, a little collapse here where I just keep track of whether or not I'm filtering. And we just have two filters, appointment reason and a search string for searching the notes on the appointments, okay? And that's the same kind of filtering we've done in the past. And then here's my table looping through all of the actual appointments, right? So I have my headers that are submit buttons as well, Okay, in this region, I'm just setting my total so I can manually add up the total fees for all the appointments and show that at the bottom of the table. Okay, and by the way, in the column heading here, I thought this was a good spot to put the add button. So if we're going to add a new appointment, right, notice that it goes to our patient appointment controller, goes to the add action, passes a route of patient ID equals, and we'll get the patient.id, right? And we're also going to pass the full name because when you're creating, you don't have that because we haven't predefined the object yet. Okay, and by the way, this is just using a bit of standard HTML to give me a nice little big plus sign beside add and so on, right? Okay, then we get to our for each loop where we're looping through each item in the model, which is each appointment, and showing the date, the reason, and so on. And here's that same kind of trick I showed at the last part of last term. When we have a large amount of text, okay, we can split it into an array of words. If I have more than a certain number of words, right, then I'll use a collapse to show the rest, so I can expand it or collapse it to read all of the text there. All right. Then at the end of each row of this table, I'll just have a button here for basically update and remove. In other words, edit and delete if you prefer those terms, but I'm trying to make a separation because it's not the standard implementation. So these just call the appropriate controller, patient appointment, the action, passing the ID of the appointment that we're going to either edit or delete, right? Again, just using some of these little HTML snippets here in order to indicate the proper characters I want to show on the buttons. Okay, and underneath, I'll show the total fees, right, inside the table, and that's it, it's done. Oh, look, there's our paging nav bar, so we have paging on all the appointments, and away we go. The other thing that I might mention here is, of course, underneath at the bottom of the page, we'll have links to actually edit the patient, right? And notice this goes right back to the patient's controller to edit, okay? And don't worry because our cookies keep track of the last sort filter page parameters separately for each controller. Doesn't matter, we're jumping from one controller to another. If, however, we're just going to go back to the patient list, okay, then that return URL, well, that's the one that we got when we came from the patient controller, right up here at the top. Remember I mentioned, right? So we set that in the view data, the return URL to the last filtering setup of the patient's controller. So we can go back to the patient list and have all the same filter and sort and everything else in place. And that's just our popover stuff. Now, it looks like a lot of code, but just think of it as really 2 pages in one. This is the standard, right, HTML for the list of appointments, more or less. And above is the standard details for this one patient. And we're using this trick to get the patient object so we can show with metadata all the information about the patient. Okay, so that's the index. Let's just run it and we'll actually see the index come up. Now, I don't have a link to it yet, so I'll have to manually cheat a little bit and type a URL. Should have taken time to do the link. It would have saved me some trouble. Let me just log in here. Yeah, hopefully I can be remembered. If now, if I go to patients, I just need to find out what an ID is. So if I go to details right now, this does not yet take me to where I want to go. I can see details /4. So this is my Fred Flintstone, right? Okay, so I'm just going to cheat. So it's patient APPT. Oh, it's not for, it's not an ID. I have to actually specify that it's patient ID equals 4. There we go. And here's our patient, Fred Flintstone. Okay. And here's all the details information. So this is typically what we would find on the details view, right, for the actual patient themselves. And then down below, here are the history of appointments, right? We can filter. Okay. Now I only have one. This in my seed data, it only gave me one, right? So no point applying a filter at this point in time. Maybe I'll go and let's add. Oh, I don't have the other pages here yet. Okay, so we're just showing you this one for now. But you can see how it's an effective master detail page The main difference between this and that earlier example, again, is the fact that we have full sorting and filtering and paging. Once we get the other pages in place, then we're going to be good. I'm going to stop the recording now before we go on to the next pages.